Hello and welcome to What's Happening in Myanmar, a new weekly show from the Frontier Myanmar podcast family. I'm your host, Luke Corbin. At Frontier, we know how hard keeping track of events in Myanmar can be. And in this podcast, I'm joined by journalists and experts to discuss some of the most consequential, convoluted, or just plain interesting stories of the past week. It's Friday, November 8, 2024, and today, on only our second episode, I'm joined by Yan Nui, journalist with Frontier Myanmar. Hello, Yan Nui.
Hello, Luke. Thank you for having me.
Yan Nui's voice has been disguised for security reasons. We're also joined by Hunter Marston, PhD candidate in international relations at the Australian National University, who has published widely on US-Myanmar relations. Hello, Hunter.
Hello.
Okay, and to kick the podcast off, let's first cover some of the week's news in brief. Military massacres of civilians and National Unity Government personnel continued this week, with particularly awful killings in Sagaing region's Gani and Bali townships, and villages set ablaze by marauding troops in Gantbalu township. Elsewhere in Sagaing, resistance groups are still fighting for control of the town of Indore, which is on the important road between Shwebo and Myitkyina. And the Kachin Independence Army and Kachin Region People's Defence Force appear to have captured two new outposts, ostensibly staffed by 200 individual soldiers and their allies in Homalin Township. The KIA is also now formally administrating their recent territorial gains in what the Myanmar military calls Kachin State's Special Region 1, which encompasses the mountainous Chipwe and Tsolo townships, basically between the Maika River and the Yunnan border. The area is a rare earth mining hub with significant Chinese investment and was previously run by a border guard force under the military, formerly known as the New Democratic Army, Kachin. That BGF had increased its forced conscription efforts in the area since July, but it appears to have been for naught, and the army's patriarch looks to have fled to China. The effects of this could be significant, as will be reported soon in a new Frontier feature. And staying with mines and stones, reports have emerged that small-scale ruby mining has recommenced at Mogot, the cosmopolitan and well-established ruby mining hub now controlled by the Da'an National Liberation Army. Access to the mines is strictly controlled by the TNLA, which claims rules are in place to protect and conserve the natural environment. As reported by Frontier last month, the exiled National Unity Government claims it will administrate the town jointly with the TNLA starting next year. But the TNLA, for its part, is yet to confirm this. And the ongoing battle for the Western Regional Military Command in An Township has quietened this week, but Frontier Myanmar's Media Monitor newsletter this Thursday translated reports from the Pendulum Times that resistance groups claim to have killed 10 soldiers this week in attacks on outposts on the main road connecting An to Magwe region, keeping pressure up on the vital resupply and reinforcements route. And a ways north of An, the town of Phalam in Chin State is currently teetering on open conflict, with the majority of its residents fleeing to nearby rural areas or further away since late last month, after an artillery shell fired from the military's infantry battalion base, which is stationed on the mountaintop in the town, landed nearby and killed a local resident. Phalam has been on a knife's edge before, but since the 2021 coup, it has never been depopulated so thoroughly. The Myanmar military still controls most major towns in Chin State, including the state capital Hakka, Phalam, and Kanpelet. And while it nominally controls Mindat town, airstrikes are still very common there. The majority of the state and rural areas, by contrast, are controlled by resistance groups. And in Thailand, over 100 Thai nationalists held protests in Bangkok this Tuesday against a recent government announcement that almost 500,000 long-term immigrants would receive citizenship, a large proportion of which would likely be from Myanmar, given there are millions of Burmese people working legally and illegally in Thailand's fishing, construction, tourism, and other industries. Now moving on to the stories we'll be discussing in depth today. We're starting with the election of Donald Trump in the United States just this Tuesday. He's won the Electoral College and, likely, the popular vote, and his Republican Party has won the Senate and possibly the House of Representatives as well, which would give him almost unfettered presidential power after being inaugurated in January. But even before then, American foreign policy is expected to be quickly thrown into turmoil. While Trump is known for, among other things, his lies and bluster, and he has made many unlikely promises during his campaign, one thing does seem clear. Trump intends to wind back or trash most of Biden's signature foreign policy initiatives. Now, while Myanmar is not a priority for the United States, the US is a priority for certain stakeholders in Myanmar. And since the 2021 coup, America has spent millions of consequential dollars on aid and support for pro-democracy individuals and organizations. So my first question to you, Hunter Marston, is will the incoming Trump administration differ from the Biden one when it comes to Myanmar and interacting with its military, the revolution, and China?
Just in broad strokes, I don't expect a great deal of change, and that's partly because Myanmar is not a priority for Washington at this point. Washington's Indo-Pacific strategy has largely focused on checking China's rise. For better or worse, that doesn't really extend to competing with China in Myanmar. And I think that by and large, the Biden team, which many of whom were around for the transition to democracy under the USDP in Myanmar in the 2010s, don't want to touch Myanmar for fear of tarnishing their legacy. And as a result, Myanmar policy has been relatively hands-off in Washington since the coup. It's been a slow or incremental increase in sanctions, steady provision of humanitarian assistance, and funding for civil society organizations. But the U.S. has been fairly reticent, actually highly reticent, to do more to support the resistance or be seen as supporting the resistance. And despite the Burma Act and a relatively active Congress on Burma issues, the Biden administration never really followed through to the full potential of that legislation to support the resistance or do more than merely place sanctions on military leaders.
Okay, so maybe not so much change at the presidential level. But yeah, what about that Burma Act and the new composition of the House of Representatives? Will that change the way that the Burma Act is handled?
Well, actually, I do anticipate the possibility for change if the Republicans control both houses of Congress, given some of Senator Mitch McConnell of Kentucky's statements that we should be doing more on the Burma Act. I would anticipate that the Republicans may push this issue. Now, traditionally, Burma policy in U.S. government has been, if not dominated, then largely the domain of the Congress rather than the White House. So I don't expect the White House or national security team under Trump to take a very active stance on Burma and Myanmar issues. I would anticipate perhaps a policy review, which could lead to marginal changes and perhaps more policy changes to put U.S. policy in line with the Burma Act, which would include nominally the appointment of a special envoy for Burma-Myanmar issues, and also the provision perhaps of non-lethal assistance in the form of technical assistance, communications technology, and perhaps aerial surveillance and early warning detection radar equipment for the resistance groups in Myanmar.
Very interesting. You've published a sort of roundup of the first Trump administration's Myanmar policy in a Rutledge Handbook. And there you said that the administration had a sort of bipolar approach, focusing on responding to the Rohingya atrocities, but also on competing with China for influence in Myanmar. China, assumingly, would not appreciate a more effectively enabled implementation of the Burma Act. And speaking of China, the other major foreign affairs news for Myanmar this week is that Senior General Aung Hlaing has visited China for the first time since his disastrous 2021 military coup. He's attending some regional summits and tellingly not meeting with Chinese President Xi Jinping, but he did meet with Chinese Premier Li Qiang. Now, the general's invitation was apparently downplayed by the Chinese Communist Party when Myanmar's exiled National Unity Government sent them an official complaint, but the military-owned media in Myanmar has been representing the trip as of great importance, highlighting China's steadfast support for the military's planned elections. The visit comes as China continues to pressure armed groups operating just over its Yunnan border to come to yet another accommodation with the Myanmar military regime, which has been humiliated repeatedly in the past year, losing huge amounts of militarily and ideologically important territory, also very lucrative territory, near the China border. So, Hunter, how significant is the coup-maker general's long-sought-after trip to China, coming as it does now in November 2024?
It's partly significant. I think it does signal that Beijing has tacitly put its support behind the SAC and done so more overtly for the first time in recent months. Since Operation 1027, as you note, the junta has seen massive battlefield losses, and therefore China has leaned heavily on the SAC to push forward with their elections plan to take place around this time next year, perhaps. And on that note, there are a number of shared interests between Beijing and the generals in Naypyidaw, primarily extending to stability on the border, which the junta has been unable to guarantee, given the lack of its power and territorial control on the northern border with China. So I think China is showing that it is supportive of the SAC to an extent, and it's willing to endorse it if it goes along with China's preferred plan to hold elections and therefore find some peaceful transfer of power away from the hands of Aung Hlaing. And for that reason, we're not seeing a meeting between Aung Hlaing and Xi Jinping, but Li Qiang, the Chinese premier, is not an insignificant figure. And the nature of the meeting surrounds the occasion was the Greater Mekong Subregion Summit, the Ayeyarwady Chao Phraya Mekong Economic Cooperation Strategy Summit, and the Cambodia-Laos-Myanmar Vietnam Summit. So all of these are rather technical meetings, which don't extend to the level of leader-leader meetings or the summit that Aung Hlaing would really crave for undergirding or giving his regime legitimacy.
Yeah, as mentioned, all of these defeats, given how weak the Myanmar military is right now, even holding limited staged elections in areas that are relatively predictable, seems out of reach for the military. I mean, what capacity does the military actually have to, oppose China in anything at the moment? And how could it realistically appease China at this sensitive time?
Yeah, I think if we're looking for signals of appeasement, the approval of infrastructure and energy projects is one way, and that's something that Aung Hlaing signaled very early on in the early days after the coup in March 2021, that the SAC was eager to renew some of the hydroelectric dams that China was interested in moving forward in Myanmar. But I don't think the SAC really has any leverage when it comes to pushing back on China's influence in the country, and that's quite obvious in with regards to the cyber scam compounds, where Beijing actually leaned quite heavily on the junta and came in, essentially violated Myanmar's territorial sovereignty to rescue their own citizens and clamp down on some of these, literally fly out the criminal overlords who are running these cyber scam compounds, whether or not the SAC approved of this. So the junta has very little control over what China does when it comes to Myanmar policy, and I think is mostly just trying to keep the lights on and keep Chinese money coming in to its coffers.
Okay, and can you think of anything that China could do, or the Myanmar military could do, or indeed resistance groups could achieve over the next 4 years of a Trump administration that may change that administration's approach or even stimulate direct action to and into Myanmar's affairs?
Yes, I think something along the lines of a Hambantota port, and Hambantota being in Sri Lanka, a major Chinese infrastructure deal, primarily in the military domain, would give the Trump administration reason to take a more activist stance when it comes to Myanmar. I don't see that taking place. I think even Aung Hlaing has certain red lines when it comes to Chinese presence and influence in the country, and he's not willing to cede that level of sovereignty to Beijing. But that remains to be seen.
And what also remains to be seen is just who Donald Trump will pick as Secretary of State and other important appointments that might affect foreign policy in Southeast Asia. I'm sure, just like us here at Frontier Myanmar, you will be keeping a close eye on the developments in Washington, D.C. And now we'll just take a minute out of the show to ask you, the listener, did you know that Frontier Myanmar has another weekly podcast? It's called Dot Atan, which means Our Voice, and it's focused on human rights issues in Myanmar, produced in both English and the Burmese languages. This week's episode is about Naga communities and the choices that young people make there when confronted with conscription. You can find that on all the normal platforms, as well as on the Frontier website. Now back to the show. Next up, teachers have been thrust into the spotlight again recently after many were compelled to assist the military's State Administration Council and workers' enumerators in its failed census. This week, Frontier published a feature story with teacher testimonies demonstrating how state employees in general are being taken advantage of, ignored, underpaid, or not paid at all by the military regime's bureaucracy. Teachers displaced by the widening armed conflict in the country are particularly vulnerable. Now, Yanui, your reporting was instrumental to this feature story. Could you begin by giving listeners who may not be aware a general picture of the pressure felt by teachers in Myanmar who rely on the military bureaucracy for their livelihoods and haven't joined, or have joined and returned from, the civil disobedience movement that started nearly 4 years ago?
At the beginning, just after the coup, large numbers of civil servants joined the CVM, but some later returned to their jobs due to fears for their safety and financial security. Even so, there are still hundreds of thousands of civil servants who remain in the CDM, and the Basic Education Workers Union thinks there are nearly 150,000 teachers in the CDM. Before the coup, there was a total of about 450,000 teachers in both basic education and higher education. Actually, almost all teachers joined the CDM right after the coup. In June 2021, when the junta prepared to open the schools, the Education Ministry made a final call for the teachers to return to work and started to dismiss the CDM teachers. At the time many teachers returned, it's understandable because most of them rely on their salaries, even though it's not a good enough income. The salary is just around 250,000 Myanmar kyat, including extra allowances, so that equals only about $54 per month. They worried for their future in the CDM because they had been teaching for many years and they did not want to take the challenge of finding new jobs. And at the same time, the junta was threatening their lives and arrested many civil servants who joined the CDM.
Thank you. And in this feature, you profiled several regime teachers, including their flights from conflict areas, and the indifference that they have been met with by other education ministry professionals and really gatekeepers. Now, the teachers who stayed in their jobs instead of joining the CDM or returned from the CDM, they kind of expect their loyalty to be repaid, especially if they're displaced by conflict. But instead, in your story, they report that they've become the victims of a rigid, uncaring bureaucracy that fails to help them in emergencies.
Yes, I interviewed 7 teachers who fled from conflict areas for my story. The same thing that they all talk to me is about how they are upset with the junta. I found out that only one of these 7 teachers was actually a real supporter of the military. All the other teachers just chose to work for the junta because of financial security. Gomo Tet from Demoso Township of Karenni State, where the Myanmar military and the Karenni resistance groups had been fighting for several months, was more upset with the junta than other teachers because the military junta that he supports failed to provide assistance to him to relocate and failed to issue him a salary. He had to move to township in Shan State independently with his own plan. It cost him much money, with rental fees and other costs like buying kitchen materials. Relocating is expensive for teachers without a good financial background. At the same time, the junta stopped paying them their salaries, putting the burden on civil servants from conflict areas who already have enough. Gomotet told me that he showed his loyalty to the military because 80% of civil servants in his township joined the CDM after the coup, but he received back nothing from them. All the teachers I interviewed believed the junta stopped paying them their salaries when they were no longer teaching, even though the junta gave different excuses for stopping the payments, like the mechanism between the teachers and the ministry had stopped. In this situation, the teachers believed the junta should provide another system for them, teachers like them who are in conflict areas, such as relocation fees, transportation allowances. but the junta has totally failed its own staff and showed how poor their management is for their staff.
And one teacher that you talked to that fled conflict first tried to work as what's called an associate teacher, which means a teacher that joins another school in Dongwu and then in Bago, using up all of her savings, living without an income and dealing with constant requests for bribes. But in the end, she had to take an administrative job at a garment factory in a major city far away. Is it sort of now becoming common for these displaced non-CDM teachers to leave the profession altogether?
Yes, there are many teachers who are trying to become associate teachers because they will receive a salary only when they become associate teachers. In fact, it shouldn't be this way. To apply to be an associate teacher is solely the responsibility of the teachers right now, but in reality, the ministry is supposed to assign the teachers elsewhere when they inform the ministry that they had to reside somewhere new. Now the teachers have to find schools and apply themselves. If the principal of a school refuses to accept them, they have to find another, and they feel like a pushover. So teachers, like for example one from Tantabin Township in Bago region I spoke to, decided not to work as an associate teacher after she failed to be selected. She is in her 20s and is so young, so she can take the challenge to work in a new work environment. There will be many young teachers from conflict areas who choose this same road. Some move to urban cities like Yangon, while many also migrate to neighboring countries through the borders.
And what does all of this mean for students and the education system in Myanmar in general?
As for whether this impacts children's education under the military regime, I think the education is already ruined. For example, the junta has replaced teachers who joined the CDM with unqualified people, and many students who have had to flee from war, just like their teachers, well, most of them are not attending school, though some have transferred into new schools in peaceful places. I often hear that the performance of teachers is not good at school. They cannot teach the curriculum effectively and do not have enough experience. They just teach students to pass the exam and do not pay attention to whether the students understand their lessons. So as long as the junta rules this country, we cannot expect any good benefit from education.
Thank you, Yanhui. And with those words, let me now turn to ask you, the listener, are you a Frontier Myanmar member? For just $8 a month, you can support independent journalism in Myanmar and enjoy regular news, translations, and analysis direct to your device. You also get to attend private member events in person and online and meet Frontier journalists. Go to frontiermyanmar.net and click Membership. Now, before we finish, a quick dive into correspondence. First, thanks to everyone who contacted us with questions and comments about the news and with some advice about this show over the last week. You may have noticed that emails sent to the address provided on the last show actually bounced. This was due to a technical error. The situation is resolved now, and we encourage you to email all your thoughts to the new address, whimyanmar@proton.me. Also starting this week, we've expanded the show notes underneath each episode with timecodes and subjects, so you can skip straight to the parts you want to prioritize if you're short on time, as well as the show's contact details and links to publications or stories by our special guests each week. And speaking of that, we have a great bunch of links below the show this week, and it's time to say thank you and goodbye. First to you, Yanhui.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you for coming on the show, your first podcast. And to you, Hunter Marston. Thank you for joining all the way from Washington, D.C.
That's right, Luke. Thank you so much for your time.
Next week on the show, we'll have two journalists discussing Frontier Myanmar's newest feature story, now live on the website, about the deadly standoff between the Kachin Independence Army and the military after the latter took control of the Lucky Man Hotel in the Northern Jade mining hub of Pakant Township this September. We'll also do a deep dive with them into the KIA's recent successes in Chipwe and Solo townships and their new control of rare earth mines on the Chinese border, what this means for local people, and the ongoing effects of China's border closures. Until next week, farewell, stay connected, and take care.